Today we're going to be talking about Moses. But before we talk about Moses, let's back up a few hundred years and see how Moses got here. We find them in Egypt. How did they get to Egypt? What happened? What happened at the end of Genesis? Where were we?
Well, the famine and the Joseph story was how they got to Egypt.
Right.
You also got to think about the idea that was prophesied in Genesis 15, that your descendants are going to go to Egypt. Or I don't think it says Egypt, but they're going to be there for about 400 years.
And it happened just that way.
Yes.
If you're at Exodus 1 in your Bible and you look at the previous page, it's going to have the very end of the book of Genesis. Joseph got there because his brothers were jealous of him and they sold him into slavery. They were going to kill him, but one of the brothers kept them from killing him and said, no, let's sell him instead. So a caravan was coming by. They sold him into slavery, and that caravan took him to Egypt, and he became a slave in Egypt. But God was with him. In fact, the last of Genesis 50, verse 19, this was after he reconciled with his brothers and was about to bring the family back to Egypt with them to survive the family. Joseph said, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives. So at the end of Genesis, what they intended to harm Joseph, it turned around and God used that because Joseph rose to second in command in Egypt during the famine. He was in charge of collecting the food in 7 years of plenty so that they would have food in the 7 years of famine. And he brought his family to Egypt, and they numbered about 70 people in all. If you look at the commentaries and if you add up who's the who's who went to Egypt with Joseph and Jacob and the brothers and their families, about 70 people. Then you turn the page and go to Exodus 1, and this is about 400 or 430 years later when Moses is born. And now the Hebrew people, it says somewhere, I think chapter 12, it numbers the men at 600,000. That's not counting the women and children. If you count the women and children, we're talking somewhere about 1.5 million people in 400 years. So that 70 people turned into 1.5 million. So much so that Egypt was afraid of them. What are we going to do with all these people? They're starting to outnumber us. They could partner up with our enemies and defeat us. So instead, they enslaved them. And they enslaved, not only did they treat them as slaves, they treated them very harshly as slaves. They were so afraid that the numbers of Hebrews were growing that Pharaoh told the Egyptian midwives, when you go to a Hebrew woman that's giving birth, if it's a boy, if it's a son, kill him. But the midwives did not obey Pharaoh. And God blessed the midwives for not doing that. They came up with a story. These women are so robust, they're giving birth before we get there. So Pharaoh makes another edict, and he tells all of Egypt to throw all the baby boys in the Nile. Kill all Hebrew baby boys. You can let the women, the girl children's live, but destroy the boys. We got to get a hold of the population of these Hebrews. And that's the story that we pick up with. Everybody remembers this in your Bible classes when you were old enough to hear the first Bible lessons. You heard about Moses in a basket with pitch on the inside to make it waterproof. They hid him for 3 months. Then his mother puts him in a basket and floats him in the reeds on the Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe. And by the time Moses is born, he already has a brother and a sister. He has a brother, Aaron, and a sister named Miriam. Miriam's hiding in the bulrushes on the edge of the river, waiting and watching to see if the princess of Egypt, the daughter of Pharaoh, sees the basket. She does. And she looks inside and she sees a baby. She has compassion on him and she takes him as her own. She adopts a Hebrew baby into the royal family. Now Miriam's in the bulrushes watching. So she runs over and says, "You're going to need a nursemaid. How about if I find a Hebrew woman who can nurse this child for you?" She said, "Do that and I'll pay her." Well, who did she go get? Moses' mother. And they paid her to raise her own child. Now, all this time he was a Hebrew and he knew he was a Hebrew. In fact, his mother made sure he knew and was brought up with that part of his life, knowing that he was a Hebrew. But at the same time, he's Pharaoh's grandson. He's adopted into the royal family. He's brought up as an Egyptian. Not only does he know the Egyptians' ways, he's educated as an Egyptian. Think of all of the ways that he benefited from being in Pharaoh's house. Okay, so we see God's favor in protecting Moses as a baby, for making this all come about, having his mother help raise him, and him being in the royal family, in Pharaoh's family. Now we move on a little bit, and this is in Exodus 3. I'm sorry, that's too far. In Exodus 2, we see that apparently Moses is kind of in charge of what's going on. You know, you got Hebrews making bricks. Maybe they're hauling stones. Maybe they're building pyramids. Whatever they're doing, and he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he's gonna beat him to death. What happens? What does Moses do? He steps in to stop the beating, but it doesn't just stop there. He kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. And he thinks nobody's seen it. But the next day, he sees 2 Hebrew brothers fighting, and he steps in to break up the fight. And they say, "Who made you a ruler over us? Are you going to kill us like you did that Egyptian yesterday?" Uh-oh. They know. He knows that they know. And then Pharaoh finds out about it, and he runs for his life. So we don't know how old Moses is at this time, probably a young man, but he runs for his life. And where does he go? He runs to Midian. Midian, pardon?
He's about 40 years old.
He's about 40 when this happens?
Yeah. And
he stays in Midian for 40 years. So when he comes back to Egypt, he's an old man, or he's in his 80s. So when he flees to Midian, and I had to look this up, Midian is in the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt is here. Across the Red Sea is Arabia. There's Midian here in the Sinai Peninsula, between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. Desert area, big area, probably 300-400 miles away from where he ran from. And there he meets his future wife. There were women at a well being harassed by, I'm not even sure who the ones that were doing the harassing, But Moses steps in and protects the women. They were shepherd women. They were watering their sheep. He drives these men away. The women go to water their sheep, and then the women invite him to the home of her father. His father is Jethro. Jethro is described as being a priest of Midian. However, he was a pagan priest, not a Hebrew priest, but a pagan priest. And his daughter tells the story, and he gives Moses, one of his daughters, as his wife. His wife is named Zipporah. And they stay in Midian for about 40 years. He has sons. It doesn't mention any daughters, but we know he has a son named Gershom and another son named Eleazar, I think. Not a lot is told about in Exodus about them, but they come up again in Chronicles. We can read more about who they were in the Bible later. While he's in Midian, flees Egypt, goes to Midian. One day he's herding some sheep, and he's on a mountain called Mount Horeb. And he sees this bush burning, but it doesn't burn up. It's on fire, but it doesn't burn up. So he's curious. He goes over a little closer, and then he hears the voice of God. Take off your shoes because you are on holy ground. And he has this conversation with God. Yahweh God is calling him. And he tells him he has seen the plight of his people, Israel, in Egypt. And he wants Moses to go deliver them. Well, Moses is reluctant to do that. He said, you sure you want me to do that? Who am I to do that? God says, I'll be with you. He asked, well, who shall I say sent me when I go? And God says, tell them, I am sent you. I am that I am. I took kind of an aside when I got to this part, because when I seen that, I remembered what Jesus said. In John 8, John 8:58, he was having a conversation with the Jews about Abraham. And Jesus told him, before Abraham, I am. They took up rocks to stone him. That was blasphemous. He used the same language that God used to call himself the I am. Jesus said, I am. Before Abraham, I am. In John, and you'll know this too, there's seven other times that Jesus said, I am. It's the same form of the word that God used to describe his name. In John 6:35, he said, I am the bread of life. In John 8:12, he said, I am the light of the world. In John 10:7, he said, I am the door. In John 10:11, he said, I am the good shepherd. In 11:25, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. In 14:6, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in John 15:1, he said, I am the true vine. So that was kind of when I saw that, it's not in the lesson, but it took me there. And I just thought how significant that was. That when Moses meets God and God says, I am, that was one of the ways that Jesus was saying, it put himself on an equality with God. He was telling them, I am God. Not just the Son of God, I am God. And they didn't understand that. And they got him killed. But that killing on the cross was a culmination of the plan that God had all along in redeeming mankind. So unwaringly, they were falling into, or they were fulfilling prophecy as well. Jesus knew from the time that he got here and could understand. He knew what his mission was, and he accepted that mission, and he was obedient, even to death on the cross. Now, that's a lot of information, and we've got some more to do, but that kind of catches us up to who Moses was, how God called him, and how he said, I'll be with you when I want you to do these things. I want you to deliver my people from Egypt. So Moses is the deliverer. I mentioned a while ago that this was on Mount Horeb. Some of you know this. What's another word for Mount Horeb? Mount Sinai. It's the same place. So even though Moses leaves to go back to Egypt and he brings the people out of Egypt, he comes back to this same mountain, and that's where he receives the law. That's where he receives the 10 Commandments. The same mountain. If we had time, and we don't, there's a great lesson about the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues in Egypt that were, Pharaoh said, okay, I'm going to let you go, and then he changed his mind and said, no, I'm not. But 10 times, 10 plagues, and all of the different plagues had something to do with a god or a goddess of Egypt. I knew a little bit about this, and when I kind of went and researched it a little bit, what was the first plague? Frogs?
Blood.
No, water turned to blood. That was an assault on the god of the Nile. The second one may have been frogs. That there was, and I can't say all the names of these gods and goddesses, but the head of this goddess was a frog. Frogs was the plague. There was another plague of flies. The god or goddess of the dust or the earth had the head of a fly. So there was a lot more going on than just reading through the 10 plagues. It was a direct assault on Egypt's gods, showing that Yahweh, the Hebrew God, was stronger and was the only God, not all of these gods that Egypt had. It wreaked havoc on Egypt's economy. It totally devastated the land. And finally, the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh gave up and he said, get out. But then he changed his mind again and chased them. Now, can you imagine getting to the Red Sea and Moses holding his staff out, the Red Sea parting, and 1.5 million people walking across in dry land? This is epic. This is biblical proportions when you talk about plagues and the Red Sea dividing, and then Pharaoh's army chases them across the dry land of the Red Sea, and then God let the waters come back together and the army's destroyed. We really didn't get to the application of all of this about the life of Moses, but think about how God made all of this happen. Think about how he protected Moses as a baby. He was with him as the deliverer, bringing his people out of Egypt and giving them the promised land, the land that he promised Abraham that he would give them. It's coming about. And it's coming about because of the strength of the Lord. The Lord is making this happen. God is with them and making this happen. Think about Moses as not only the deliverer, but the lawgiver. He's the one that went up on the mountain and brought down the tablets Of course, they didn't. He must have been gone a long time because they thought he was dead. They had Aaron build an idol, a golden calf. And of course, Moses reacted, and he threw the tablets down and broke them. And he had to go back up and do all of that over again. But Moses was an intercessor for the children of Israel as well. God was going to kill them and just start all over. I'm done with you. And Moses pled for them and changed God's mind. Moses was the intercessor, the lawgiver, the deliverer from slavery. Now look at the similarities between Moses and Jesus. Jesus delivers us from our sin, like Moses delivered them out of slavery. Jesus is our intercessor, like Moses was an intercessor for the children. He was the go-between. God spoke to Moses, Moses spoke to the people. Jesus is our intercessor today. Moses is the lawgiver. Jesus has showed us the law of Christ and has given us our marching orders, the way that we're to live. We're to love God and love our neighbor. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Love God with all your mind, heart, soul, body, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Greg was to give us a lesson coming up on the Ten Commandments, and that's going to be, I think, it's the first Sunday in May when Gareth Flannery's going to be here, so we're not going to have Bible class that. I told him go ahead and study for that. We'll have that another time, because that is a tremendous lesson on the Ten Commandments. The first four is about us and God. The rest of them are about us and getting along with each other.
I would make the argument, we say that the Old Testament law was nailed to the cross. But I would make the argument we never escaped the Ten Commandments.
Nope.
They are throughout the New Testament in some form.
If anything, he redefined them and made them even more important and gave more meaning to them than just the letter of a law. It involved the heart as well. I did a lot of talking. I meant to have some discussion, but it's okay. We'll do that another time. We're out of time today. Think about how God worked through Moses. Think about the similarities between Moses and Jesus. And think about how God is working through his church, through us today. There's a lot of good life applications. I wish we had spent maybe more time talking about that than just about a rehashing of who Moses was. But anybody got anything else? Have a great week. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And Andy Baker will have the Bible class hour next week. So he's going to come and preach for us Sunday morning worship, and then he'll have the Bible class time. And I believe it's going to be a combined Bible class where all ages will meet in here and listen to what he has to say about world Christian broadcasting. We've supported that for many years. It's still going. It's still going strong, and it's reaching untold thousands of people by shortwave radio every day. So pray about that. Good work. Have a good week.